Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to AAJA Women and Non-Binary Voices second Career Spotlight webinar. I'm today's moderator, Jin Ding. Before I introduce myself and today's guest speaker, Daniella Zalcman, let's go through some basic logistics. I would like to remind you that this webinar is open to everyone, not only AAJA members. We will be recording it, so you can share later with your network using the same link. AAJA, Asian American Journalism Association, Women and Non-Binary Voices is a new affiliated group founded this year. We are an inclusive support group for women, non-binary, and other gender non-confronting AAJA members to promote a plurality of Asian voices. We also welcome non-feminine identifying allies to join and show their support for their colleagues. And during today's webinar, if you have any questions, please tweet at us with the hashtag AAJ Hangout, and we will be taking questions in the end. My name is Jin Ding. I'm the co-director of this group and also communications and inclusion manager at the Policy Center. My preferred pronouns are she, they. Today, our guest speaker, Daniella Zalcman, is a documentary photographer based between Paris and New York. She's a multiple grantee from the Policy Center, a fellow with the IWMF, International Women's Media Foundation, a National Geographic Explorer, and the founder of Women Photograph, an initiative working to elevate the voices of female and non-binary visual journalists. Her work tends to focus on the legacies of Western colonialization, from the rise of homophobia in East Africa to the forced assimilation education of indigenous children in North America. Her ongoing project, The Science of Your Identity, is the recipient of the 2017 Arnold Newman Prize, a 2017 Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award, the 2016 Photo Evidence Book Award, the 2016 Magnum Foundation's Angie Morath Award, and part of the Open Society Foundation's Moving Walls 24. Daniella, welcome to our Career Spotlight webinar.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'll go through some lists that we already prepared, and after that, we will take questions in the end. So first, what's your preferred pronoun, and also tell us a little bit about your career path.
So my preferred pronouns are she, her. Thank you for asking. And my career path began when I was in college. I went to school in New York at Columbia University, and I think I've known from a pretty early age that I wanted to be a journalist. So when I got to college, the first thing I did was I joined my college newspaper, the Columbia Daily Spectator, which is really where I learned how to be a journalist and was also really my major in college. And then I started freelancing pretty immediately for New York City publications, primarily the New York Daily News and then the Wall Street Journal. So that was sort of my pathway in. I really, at the time, to me, journalism meant newspapers, and I really wanted to work for newspapers. So I started out, I probably spent the first 5 or so years of my career as a daily news photographer, covering everything from shootings and fires and crime scenes to Fashion Week to politics to sports to pretty much everything in between. And, you know, as a newspaper photographer, I had to be a generalist. And then after a few years of that, I started to realize that as much as I loved spot news and hard news, the problem with working for a newspaper is that very often my relationship to stories and the people I was meeting was for a few minutes to a few hours at most. And I really wanted to be able to dig in a more long-term way to the places and communities and people I was meeting and documenting. So that's when I started to shift to more long-form storytelling. And that's when I met and started working with the Pulitzer Center, who have funded so much of my long-form work. And that's what led to some of those long-term projects that you mentioned.
Great. So you basically got into journalism, and I actually know that you didn't do a journalism major. Was that very challenging for you when you just started to learn photography, and how did you learn it? And also, how do you actually become a professional in this field?
I don't think it was. And in fact, I understand people who want to go to journalism school and why, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But when I meet young people before they get to that stage, especially if they're in high school and they ask me what I think they should major in, I generally encourage people not to major in journalism, just because I think, at its core, journalism is kind of a trade. And photojournalism in particular is one of those things that you really learn by doing. And so for me, my education was in working for newspapers, whether it was my student paper or, the tabloids in New York City. And that is better to me than any formalized education. It does mean that there are huge weak spots for me. I cannot light anything to save my life. A lot of the more technical things that, would probably overlap more with fine art photography, I am very weak in. But when it comes to developing the core instincts of how to be a journalist, I think you learn that by doing. So I don't really regret it. I like the way I went through college.
So right after college, you started to be a freelancer. Was that something that you prepared for, or you just suddenly just ended up doing in that way?
So I actually eased my way into it during college, and I'd intentionally wanted to go to school in New York so that I could be connected to the media world. And I probably shouldn't admit this because my parents are actually currently visiting me in Paris and they're in this room, so I probably shouldn't say this aloud. But I skipped a lot of my classes during college to go take assignments with when my editors would call me from the New York Daily News. I was majoring in architecture, and I think that actually probably was a really good thing because all of my professors had real jobs in the real world as well, and they were all maintaining their own practices at architecture firms. And so they understood that I had found the thing that I loved, that I really wanted to do, and so they didn't fail me, which I would imagine a philosophy professor or a literature professor might have. So I was very lucky, accidentally. But I started early. I started shooting for the Daily News when I was 19. So by the time I graduated, I was almost working for them full time. I was taking an assignment almost every single day of the week. So when I graduated, I already had a pretty solid grounding. And I wasn't struggling to make those connections.
So what was your a first year after college look like? You said you worked for the Daily, and did you kept doing that, or on the side you're doing freelance, or you're just completely just jumped into freelance world?
So I've been freelance my entire career. I've never had a staff job. I don't know that I ever would want a staff job. And I think I graduated into an economy that already was trending towards the sort of all freelancer gig economy. And for me, that's worked out. I think you need a very particular personality to thrive, where you have such an erratic hope for income and assignments. But I really liked it. Sorry, what was the question? I just totally lost it.
Yeah, I was basically asking what was your a first year looking like?
Yeah, I was just working full time for the Daily News, and the thing is, with any newspaper, but especially a tabloid, that means you are on call 24/7. And I had, I was a freelancer, but they were calling me 5 days a week, so it was relatively regular work. But the price of getting a call 5 days a week was that I had to be available at all times. And, I had a very particular old iPhone ringtone set for the New York Daily News switchboard. And to this day, if I hear that ringtone, I just twitch a little because I think, oh my God, there's a 3-alarm fire in the Bronx. I have to go. And, it's not my life anymore, but it was for quite a while. And I'm glad that I had those instincts, even though I don't really have a desire to photograph hard news anymore. I'm very grateful for all the things I learned while doing it.
So moving on from the hard news that you don't really like, do you remember what was your first a journalism project, or on the side, or as a freelancer, not exactly being assigned or something?
So what I basically started to do in my early 20s, because I knew that, I think for better or for worse, often for worse, when young people get into journalism, they think that they need to, or that they should go abroad and find some place they're unfamiliar with to report on from, somewhere far, far away. And I had that instinct too. And so my method was to save up and to work really hard for the Daily News, the Wall Street Journal, whomever, and save up and spend about a month of each year working on some story internationally that I thought was important. And so in 2011, 2 years after I graduated, South Sudan became a new country. And I thought, well, that seems like a politically momentous thing. So I saved up and went with another young photographer friend of mine, and we decided that we were going to go spend a month in South Sudan documenting independence and all of the things surrounding it. And it just turns out that, not only was I not a very well-established journalist and so unlikely to sell work from South Sudan, which I understood and was okay with, but it also turned out that the media just in general didn't really care about the story all that much. And so I was having such a hard time getting any eyes on my work and on the story in general. And so I ended up actually back in Uganda, where I had applied for a visa to get into South Sudan. And I had 2 weeks left before my return ticket home, and I started Googling news in Kampala, what was going on in Uganda. And I started to read about the LGBTQ community and the fact that one of their most prominent activists and the first openly gay man in the country had been murdered just a few months before I got to East Africa. It was the first time in my life I'd been to the continent. And so I reached out to these nonprofits, the nonprofit he had founded, and I kind of expected in the immediate aftermath of his murder that an outsider like myself would not really be welcomed. I would have been completely understanding of that. But to my surprise, they said, yeah, come in and you can talk to us and we'll see if there's anything that, works that's a fit for your work. And so that was the start of what turned into a 4 or 5 year long project. And it was also the first partnership I had with the Pulitzer Center. And so I spent, I think about a year and a half later, Ugandan Parliament decided that they were going to pass this anti-gay law that gained some notoriety. And so that's when I reached out to the Pulitzer Center and said, hey, I know this community. I've spent a lot of time working with these activists. I think that this is a good opportunity for me to go back. There's a real news hook. So that was sort of my first long-term project where I actually got to see the real journalistic benefits of returning to a community, of being deeply embedded in a group of people.
Yeah, so I kind of like followed your career since that project started. Want to ask you about like how you exactly explored your double exposure technique in your photography. Especially, I see a shift between like a little bit different style, even using the same technique from that project towards your later Science of Identity project. Can you explain more about that?
So I've always really loved using double exposures as a storytelling tool. And I think, especially early on when I was doing it in Uganda, I remember photo editors, I would send them the work and they'd go, oh, that's interesting, but this isn't really journalism. We can't publish this. And then a couple of years later, I was doing essentially the same thing in a different project. And all of a sudden that was acceptable. And I found that really fascinating. And I think that's maybe partially tied to the fact that we're getting a little more desperate for people to pay attention to our work. And so maybe we're more open to creativity. But in Uganda, the main reason why I started working with composites was that, I was trusted by this very small community of activists who were doing incredibly brave, incredibly dangerous work. And there was a real threat to their safety and to their livelihoods, for having their names and their faces out there. And, I think there was this incredible conflict for them of activists want to be the face of their movement. They want to be visible. They want to be seen. They want to help destigmatize and demystify their community and say, look, we are normal, everyday people. We are your neighbors and your cousins and your teachers and your coworkers, and we are gay. They wanted to be able to put a face to that movement, but also people were being beaten up and killed and jailed. And so there was this real conflict of, okay, how do I get the message out that they're asking me to help share? And how do I also make sure that my first priority is safety and not injuring or harming the people I'm documenting? And so I decided, at that point, on a regular basis, Western photographers' photos were being co-opted by Ugandan media and run under headlines like "Kill the Homos." I mean, truly awful things. And so I decided, maybe if I make double exposure portraits where I'm just taking 2 photos of one person and superimposing them, you can still see the person's identity. You can still tell who they are, but it's kind of unlikely, at least to me, it seemed, that a tabloid newspaper would say, well, we're going to steal this and put this on the front page of our paper. And to my knowledge, it never happened. And so it became sort of an artistic compromise that to me was also sort of another step towards being a more mindful, more engaged journalist.
So through doing various projects, obviously you also got a lot like grants and fellowships, much more than just my organization, Pulitzer Center, support you. Can you also talk about a little bit how you actually landing those scholarships and those fellowships and grants with like IWMF and other organizations?
Sure. And I will always say, I'm very grateful to Pulitzer because they were really the first organization that took a chance on me and funded my work. And so that will always mean a lot to me. But I'm been funded in the past few years by National Geographic Society and Open Society Foundations, the IWMF, Magnum Foundation. And, I think we often are very easily alarmist about the state of the industry, and I get that. And there are very deep fundamental problems with our industry that are particularly inaccessible to women, to people of color, to people from working class backgrounds. And those are all things we have to talk about. But there are also a lot of opportunities out there. And I think it is, it's a matter of understanding sort of the structures in place and what's available. And so the Open Society Foundations, for instance, that Moving Walls grant, which is a $30,000 grant to continue a project, that was huge.
Wow.
That gave me the time and space to really work on this project that I'm now working on called Signs of Your Identity. And so I think one of the most important things that a photographer can do is learn how to speak and write concisely and clearly about their work. And I unfortunately see a lot in different levels of education that we treat photographers like they are supplementary somehow to written journalism, and that we need to get rid of that idea. Both writing and photography are deeply important. They reach different audiences in different ways. There is something about photography that is a visceral international language. So it's very frustrating to me when I hear reporters in any way sort of slight photography. But by that same token, photographers have to consider themselves journalists and reporters as well. You cannot be a thorough documentarian if you are not yourself also doing on the ground reporting. And so I think that being able to convince people that you know your subject matter, that you've done the research, that you know the history and the context, that you've done the background reading, that to me is what is my greatest strength when I'm writing grant applications, because I know all the work that has come before. I know all of the history. I can cite all of the data. And so I think people get that from me. There's a certain OCD mentality to my writing and to my grant applications that I think makes people feel that they can trust me with work.
Great. So now we want to move on to your one of your probably biggest project, which is Woman Photograph. When you funded this, as I learned it, is from basically a Google Sheet that you ask people to answer your survey. How did you come up with this idea, and why did you do that from the first place?
So I was at a photo festival in France in 2016. And I'm in a unique position. I have a huge amount of privilege within the photojournalism industry because most of my work at this point is now grant funded. So I'm no longer waiting for a photo editor to call me and give me an assignment, but that gives me a bit more freedom to run my mouth that other photographers don't have. And I completely understand that. But it allows me to say certain things to photo editors that I think other photographers would worry about, given the desire to be hired. And I remember I was talking to a magazine editor who told me, well, I would hire more women if I knew where to find them. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, I know so many incredibly talented women photojournalists in all fields, all around the world, in so many sub-disciplines of the craft. How could someone possibly say this to my face? I'm going to make a list, and then I can never hear this excuse ever again. And so I put together a Google form. I sent it to 10 close friends, had them send it to some people. And by the time we launched February 1st, 2017, I think it was about 450 photographers strong. And I think last week we just hit 950. So there are a lot of women photographers out there, women, trans, and non-binary photographers out there. So next time an editor tries to say that to me, I have a very good response.
So all the editors, whoever is watching this webinar, if you want to find the list, you know where to go.
womenphotograph.com.
Since you're talking about a little bit about the motivation, have you ever, when you started this, first goal obviously is stop telling you that they can't find women photographers around the world. Do you have any further goals when you're starting this, and along the way, what's the new level of the goals you established?
So I think from the beginning, the other things that I was really intent on building within women photographs. So, the hiring database was the number one thing. Like, that was the resource that I wanted to create for photo editors, mostly just to make their lives easier. I know how hard photo editors work. I know how much they have on their plate. And this really was just to say, look, like, here, you don't have to do as much digging. I will make this thing that hopefully will help you out once in a while. But I was also determined to create a grant and to start a mentorship program. Those are sort of my two other big programming ideas. And so we've done that. We're now, we just judged the third annual series of Women Photograph grants, where we'll announce next month $35,000 worth of grant funding to this year's grantees. Our mentorship program is currently open for applications. So if there are photographers watching this who have less than 5 years of professional experience and you'd like to be matched with mentors over the course of a year, please check out, it's easy to find on womenphotograph.com. We also started an annual workshop that for the first 2 years took place in New York. And this year we're taking it international. This is actually, I don't know if I can announce. Yeah, well, why not? We'll be moving the workshop internationally this year. So it'll be in Ecuador in December. We also do a lot of data collection, because part of the frustration of having these conversations I found was that many people would constantly try to gaslight me and either tell me that it wasn't a problem or that the problem wasn't as bad as I thought it was. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to gather numbers, because you can't argue with data and math. So, we have a team of people who look at the lead photo bylines on the front pages of 8 international newspapers. I look at the photo of the week slideshows once a week and share those on our Twitter account. And just collecting a bunch of different statistics that way. I feel like I always forget one of our programs, but I think that's about it.
So I definitely follow the numbers of you guys that posting every single week on your Twitter account of the A1 women photograph photographers like percentage. Have you seen like any positive changes over the time through tracking? Because every single time I see it, it's just like it's never 50%, or very rarely there's one publication or two publications making the 50% quota. And then but through the past 2 years, did you see like the industry shifting or changing to that direction?
No, there's been huge change in the past couple of years, and I would like to take credit for it, and obviously it is not my responsibility. I think a combination of it being the right time and the conversations that we are having in this country around Me Too, and just a lot of growing awareness of the fact that the person behind the camera, the identity of that person, really does matter in how we see news and how we see the world. I think it was just an incredibly opportune time for me to start Women Photograph. But no, there have been huge positive changes. And I can cite specific ones. Bloomberg News, when I started counting their photos of the week, it was the same numbers as everyone else. And so, anecdotally, we know that roughly 15 to 20% of working news photographers are women. And their numbers reflected that. I think might have actually been a little bit worse. And this year, their average is 50%. 50% of the photographers they share in their weekly slideshows are women photographers. And it's both phenomenal, and it's also just so easy. If Bloomberg News can do it, so can you. So can any other news organization. The San Francisco Chronicle has done a phenomenal job. I think the last quarter of 2018. I believe if you would like to dig into the numbers for yourself, it's womenphotograph.com/data. But I believe one of the quarters last year, the San Francisco Chronicle had 50% of their A1 photos were taken by women photographers. Again, these are achievable goals. We can absolutely push the needle. And, I would argue that journalism is one of the best and easiest spaces in which we can push for gender equality. It is much harder to say that we want to push for 50% senators or 50% congressional representatives in this country. That takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and is not going to happen overnight. We can change the way our audiences see very, very quickly if we are serious about making sure we create a diverse and inclusive industry.
So have you received the feedback from the organizations that you at them every single time, or from conferences where you actually meet those editors in person since you started the organization?
Some of them ignore me. Some of them try to pretend I don't exist. And some of them are very happy to engage. And, Reuters, for instance, many of the recent hires have been women staffers. I know they're working really hard, and it's complicated when you have a lot of staff photographers that reinforce those numbers to move the dial. It takes time. I get that. And they have been working very hard. And I see that in their hiring of stringers. But I think for the most part, people are really interested in and willing to have these conversations. There are just a couple of people who kind of try to sidle past me every time they see me.
So I'm sure you definitely also receive criticism, both on your own work and also the organization you founded. I would like to hear a little bit about, as a woman photographer, how you deal with all those. How's that impacting your life?
Just like a duck. Just what's the expression? I always mix my metaphors. Water over your back, something, I don't know. You can't take it too seriously. I think it's frustrating to hear the refrain of so many photographers of, but we should only hire the best person for the job. And, as if automatically a cisgender, white, heterosexual man is going to be the best person for the job. There's the same 9 excuses that I hear over and over again that are just frankly exhausting. But it takes time, and it's an ongoing conversation. And I think we are moving more quickly in the right direction than we ever have been as an industry. And, that's not to say that there aren't incredible people who came before who were fighting and pushing for equality. But we just, there are a lot of moments where we just weren't there yet and we weren't ready yet to have the conversation. And I think this weird moment right now between Trump and Me Too, there is a greater willingness to face the reasons why these conversations are so important. So yeah, there's a lot of negative feedback. There's a lot of criticism. It's okay. It's going to happen.
Well, I'm glad you're still carrying on since you're still doing your Science of Identity project. And are you already thinking about the next project, or you're still working on this one?
So I just wrapped up the US chapter of Science of Your Identity after about 3 years. And I think this project is going to take another 10 possibly. So it depends. It depends how much the Pulitzer Center would like to keep funding me. But I think this is a project about the coercive assimilation policies that governments around the world have enacted to coerce Indigenous kids into giving up, forgetting, leaving behind their own cultural markers, their languages, their traditions. And it was violent and unfortunately extremely uniform from colonial power to colonial power across the world. So, I've worked so far in Canada, Australia, and the US, but I'd like to look at the same issues worldwide. So, in theory, I've got Japan and Taiwan and India and Morocco and Colombia and Mexico and Norway. I've got about 10 countries to go.
Wow. So just a quick reminder to whoever is listening to this webinar, if you would like to ask questions, please tweet with the hashtag AAJ Hangout, and we'll be taking them at the end. So back to Daniella, just to talk about your project. Can you just explain a little bit more, just maybe people haven't seen your work, about the chapters that you already finished in Canada, start from Canada to Australia and other places?
Sure. So I started in Canada, and I had gone there on a Pulitzer Center grant, intending to look at why Indigenous Canadians have one of the fastest growing rates of HIV of any demographic in the world. I had been at an HIV conference in Australia, also for the Pulitzer Center, related to my work in Uganda. And I read this UN report, and that statistic, I'm not in public health, but that statistic didn't make sense to me, even as a layperson. And so I wrote a grant application and was approved. And I got to Canada and spent about a month driving around Ontario, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan. And almost every single HIV positive Indigenous Canadian I talked to mentioned their time in residential school. And I had never heard of Indian boarding schools. I had never heard of this idea that both the Canadian and US government forcibly kidnapped Native children and sent them off to these boarding schools where they were beaten and assaulted and told they could not speak their languages, that they had to wear Western clothing and convert to Christianity, and there was rampant sexual assault. I mean, just awful things happened. And the majority of the people who went through those systems are still alive today. The last Canadian boarding school closed in 1996. And of the 150,000 First Nations Canadians who endured those boarding schools, 80,000 of them roughly are still alive. And I was so stunned and so taken aback that I had never known anything about this history, that I went back to the Pulitzer Center and I said, I have to go back. I have to shift the focus of this project. But I also realized that the way in which I was telling the story, which on that first trip was looking at HIV, was looking at a public health crisis, which in urban Native communities is tied to injection drug use. As a straight journalist, as a documentary photographer, I felt like I had not created an empathetic, meaningful body of work. It felt instead like I'd actually created two-dimensional stigmatizing photography that was just going to reinforce existing stereotypes and not encourage anyone to look past and think about the history and the context, which is really what I'm always trying to do with my work. So I went back to Pulitzer and I basically told them, look, this sounds weird and you're not gonna like it, but what if I make double exposure portraits of residential school survivors where I superimpose the faces of the people I interview with the sights and memories of their boarding school experiences, because this is a story about the past. And this is a story about things that mostly happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And it's about intergenerational trauma and the things that we pass on from generation to generation. And, it's about reclamation and identity, and it's all in people's heads. And so how do I show that as a photographer? I don't think I can as a straight documentarian. I think I need to rely on a different methodology, a different visual language. And luckily, the Pulitzer Center, I expected them to go, okay, crazy, that's not going to work. But luckily, they trusted me because I think I had worked with them for several years on that first project in Uganda. And they said, okay, all right, that lady, let's go, go off and do your thing. And so, yeah, I went back to Saskatchewan, and that's sort of the system, the visual language that I created for Signs of Your Identity was to create these layered portraits. So, everyone is the photo of the person I interviewed, and then I returned to the place where they had been at boarding school, or something tied to a literal memory of that experience, and create images that way.
Great. I'm sure our audience would like to see those photos, and you can definitely find that online. Just search Signs of Identity, and you'll probably jumping to one of the sites that has them. One more question about that is a lot of our members are very interested in the opportunities that Women Photograph is providing. You mentioned a little bit about mentorship program currently is opening, and also you guys give this annual grants and also workshops. Can you expand more about that, especially what exactly people should do with them, and what they can benefit from, you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. So the grants are closed for this year, unfortunately. We just judged both cycles, but we do offer at least $35,000 in project funding a year. Usually each individual grant is roughly in the $5,000 to $10,000 range. So we encourage all of you to apply. This year we have five $5,000 grants, one of which is earmarked for non-binary or trans photographer, and those are for either new or in-progress projects. And then we have one $10,000 grant, and that's for someone who is working on an ongoing long-term project. Our mentorship program is currently open for applications for our third cycle, and we'll select 22 emerging or early career photographers who are in the first 5 years of their career, and we'll match you up with both a photo editor and a photographer mentor. So you'll spend a year in conversation with those two mentors, and then it'll be you and another mentee together. So again, if you're early on in your career and you would benefit from that kind of relationship, our mentors are editors at National Geographic Society and the New York Times, and I should open it up and actually find, I can't off the top of my head, I can't think of, and then, award-winning, incredible photographers from around the world. It's a pretty international crowd. So I would, I'd encourage all of you to check that out. And then there are workshops, which happen once a year. This one is going to be in Ecuador in December and is only open to Spanish-speaking photographers. But if any of you are fluent, then I would encourage you to apply. I'm not totally sure when we'll launch applications for that, but it'll be probably August. And the workshop will be in Quito in December. So we're inviting Spanish fluent photo editors and photographers down to join us as instructors, and it should be a really good time. It's everything. We have a day of hostile environment training and first aid. We do portfolio reviews. We will have screenings and artist talks and sort of more practical business oriented talks on how you pitch and develop grant applications. So it's really fun. It'll be about 4 days.
Wow, that's just to say, I've read all the list of the mentors, and whoever wants to apply, this is a really impressive list. A lot of photographers and editors that I admire. So our members should definitely check it out. So now we have a little bit time now just to start asking questions. We got one from our member Echo Lu. She would like to ask what advice you would give to visual journalists who just started their career and for new freelancers?
I think the thing I would encourage early photographers or early career photographers to think about most is, what are the stories you want to tell? And I understand that you're not going to be able to tell those stories right away, that it's going to take time and you have to have a side hustle and you have to pay your rent and there are all sorts of things you have to worry about in the beginning. But as you are doing that, whatever, if you're working as a bartender on the weekends, if you're taking assignments from an organization that you don't necessarily feel like you jive with, that's okay. But constantly be thinking about, okay, what is the work that I do want to do, and figure out in some way, in some form, how to do little bits of that work, so that's what you can take to photo editors when you go to portfolio reviews or workshops or anything else, because you get stuck in these loops, right? And if you are showing a photo editor food photography and you're really good at food photography, but you kind of hate it, you're going to get assignments to go shoot food. So the things you need to put in front of editors are the things that you are passionate about and the things you love and what you want to spend your career doing. So whatever it takes, carve out time and money to chase those projects that are really important to you.
That's really great advice. One more question from Hannah Yoon. Hannah wants to ask, she's curious about Daniella's process when starting a project. How do you decide on how you will execute a project, what medium to use, what style you use for the project in the beginning stage?
Hey, Anna. That's a really good question. And I don't know that I have a defined process. I love to shoot in a lot of different mediums. So I often am traveling with a digital SLR, which I will avoid at all costs if I can. A medium format camera. I use like a 1950s TLR that you can get on eBay for $100. I shoot with my phone a lot. I sometimes will have an instant camera with me. And I do that because I really think that the story should dictate the medium and the process and the style. I understand, but I'm sometimes confused by photographers who have a style that they apply to everything, because then the photography is more about the photographer than it is about the people being photographed. And for me, I would much rather have the subject matter and the place and the individuals guide my methodology. So I think I show up in a place, in a new environment with no real concept of what I'm going to do. And so sometimes that's messy, and it also requires time, which is why I'm grateful for organizations like Pulitzer that allow me to sort of stretch my process over the course of weeks or months instead of having to do something in a matter of days. But it's a good question. I think it's mostly the thing that's most important is I do a ton of reading. The first time I'm in a place and I'm trying to understand what's going on around me, especially if it's a new environment, I'm reading as much as I can about the history. I'm seeing who else has done work there and what their work looks like. And that sort of will start to guide me in figuring out, okay, how can I do something that's different and effective and also is sort of an homage to the historical, political, social context.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have. So we will wrap it up here. Thanks, Daniella, for taking time talking with us today. And whoever are watching this later or watching it now, definitely consider joining AAJA and AAJA's Women Non-Binary Voices group. This is a really great family there. So everyone should check it out, and also check out the Woman Photograph website to see their new opportunities, especially they're currently opening for their mentorship program. So thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Bye, Daniella.
Bye.